Hi, everyone. We're just pausing a moment to allow everyone to get logged in and join us. We'll begin the event in just a few moments. In the meantime, I'm going to share a poll on here that just shows us how you came to see this event. So I'm going to launch that right now. And if you're able to, just please answer that poll and let us know how did you hear about this event. Is actually the thing. So
I'm going to click. I'm going to click other.
There you go. Absolutely. Yeah, do it. Do it. That's right.
Not letting me.
Oh, it doesn't. Does it not let you fill it out? Oh, that's
No.
disappointing. I didn't know they didn't let you fill it out. Okay. They won't let me fill it out.
This poll is not accurate.
Oh no. So once again, for those who are just joining us, we are just waiting a few minutes to let people get logged in, and we will begin shortly.
I demand suffrage for hosts and panelists.
No, it's just not fair. Let's see. Getting there.
Fortunately, my pallid nature makes it easy to render me, just monochromatically. I mean, really, black and white are really all you need for me.
Cool. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. And all right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. So today, thank you for joining us for today's event. My name is Nick. I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events and live events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media channels via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Rick Emerson in conversation with Chelsea Cain, talking about Rick's newest release, Unmask Alice, LSD, Satanic Panic, and the Imposter behind the world's most notorious diaries. Rick Emerson is a longtime radio and television broadcaster, the former host of the nationally syndicated Rick Emerson Show, and the co-author of Zombie Economics, A Guide to Personal Finance. In 1971, Go Ask Alice reinvented the young adult genre with a blistering portrayal of sex, psychosis, and teenage self-destruction. The supposed diary of a middle-class addict, Go Ask Alice terrified adults and cemented LSD's fearsome reputation, fueling support for the war on drugs. In 1979, another diary, a posthumous memoir of an alleged teenage Satanist, Jay's journal merged with a frightening new crisis, adolescent suicide, to create a literal witch hunt, shattering countless lives and poisoning whole communities. In reality, Go Ask Alice and Jay's journal came from the same dark place. Beatrice Sparks, a serial con artist who betrayed a grieving family, stole a dead boy's memory, and lied her way into the National Book Awards. Rick Emerson's Unmask Alice is a true story of contagious deception, doomed romance, and a vengeful celebrity, of lazy press and a public mob, of two suicidal teenagers and their exploitation by a literary vampire. Unmask Alice, where truth is stranger than nonfiction. Emerson will be joined in conversation by Chelsea Cain, a New York Times bestselling thriller author, Eisner-nominated comic book creator, and founding partner of the Ministry of Trouble. So today's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone else has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Rick and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us. A link to buy Unmasked Alice will be shared in the chat a couple of times during this event. All right, Rick and Chelsea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Howdy. I gotta say, I'm used to being the least stylish person in any gathering, but the chasm is even more yawning tonight. So
Is it the devil horns?
Well done.
You don't have devil horns, is what you're saying?
Sadly, I don't.
I think they pop with your black tea.
I think I've totally betrayed my heavy metal youth, and yeah, I feel like I should at least have like a pewtered ring of I should have like a dragon claw clutching, like a pearl or something, or like
Yes.
I should be drinking out of a flagon or something
Yes,
like that, or
you
possibly a
should.
flagon with a dragon. I don't
This
know.
is only just now occurring to you.
I don't know. One never thinks these things through in advance.
Oh, I have so much to teach you, my friend. I will say, like, I thought, a couple of days ago, I was like, oh, you know what I should do is wear devil horns when I do that thing with Rick. And I was like, do I have devil horns? And I was like, certainly I must.
So this is like an inverse of that thing where, you forget that it's, where you're the only one who goes to school and you forget that it's picture day, and everybody else is dressed up, or it's, it's that thing anyway. Yeah.
It's exactly like that.
It's
yes,
exactly
yes.
like that.
But I found these in my costume box, and I put them on, and because I didn't want to forget to have them on, I've been wearing them the last couple hours, including a time where I popped my head into my daughter's room, like she was watching a show with a friend of hers, and I was like, hey guys, and they were like, hey, no, didn't make a comment. Just like, hey, that's Eliza's mom, she's kind of funny. I do see Powell's people. I don't think I can respond to the chat. So if you can allow me to do that with a setting, that would be cool, because I see there are some questions in the chat. But we are here to talk about Rick's new book. Look, you can tell I've read it because there's a post-it note. But right, it's called Unmask Alice. You can get it anywhere books are sold, but ideally, specifically, Powell's books, I think, is probably where you want to order it from. And this is a really interesting kind of deep dive into the book Go Ask Alice, and to the author of Go Ask Alice, which was certainly a book that I grew up, knowing about Go Ask Alice, in terms of it just being a book that was sort of whispered on the playground, but like nobody had read it, or the kids who claimed to have read it, I thought were full of shit, right? So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, Rick, about like how you came to tell this story, like why it felt important to you to tell.
So I grew up, like a lot of people, I lived through two social panics. The first was the war on drugs, and not just the war on drugs, but the kind of 1980s Nancy Reagan just say no era of the war on drugs, where things really got amped up, just like an insane level. Because the war on drugs, especially during the 80s, it was like 1 part logic, 10 parts insanity, where there was no differentiation made between, any of the different, every drug was sort of put into one nefarious basket. And there was this idea that there was some trench-coated maniac around every corner that was waiting to dose like whatever it was you had with you with LSD or angel dust, which that seems to be a thing that's gone by the wayside. We don't really hear much about angel dust these days, but that was, it was a huge part of my childhood and all the way into high school. And then, I don't know, my sophomore or junior year of high school, things kind of shifted to where alongside the war on drugs, there was now this other social panic. And that was, of course, these platoons of underground Satanists. They were just apparently covens just as far as the eye could see, or not see possibly. And that they were waiting to lure us into, witchcraft and black magic and debauchery and et cetera. And it started with, there was the idea of Dungeons and Dragons being evil. And of course, and that escalated to heavy metal and, horror novels and horror movies. And it really just became this, as I sort of say in the beginning of the book, this contagious delusion. And so I lived through both of those things. And what I didn't know at the time, and what I found out later, is that both of those things, the Satanic Panic and the war on drugs, they were, unleashed by, or certainly accelerated by, this pair of teenage diaries, Go Ask Alice and Jay's Journal. And when I eventually learned that both of those diaries came from the same strange place, which was this giant house with blood red walls on the outskirts of Provo, Utah. And then when I further learned that nobody really told that story, it was sort of like, well, if I want to read this book, I guess I had to write the book in order to read it, because it didn't exist.
Yeah, and I think that is really interesting. And I want to talk about that because I had never heard of Jay's Journal. Certainly I had heard of Go Ask Alice. For anybody who hasn't, these were both books that were diaries, purported diaries by teenagers who die at the end.
Yeah, so Go Ask Alice is, yeah, it's presumably it is ostensibly the posthumous diary of a teenage addict. This girl who gets lured into drug use, runs away from home. She relapses, she gets clean, she relapses. She has a total nervous breakdown at one point, ends up in an asylum, and then eventually dies at the end, leaving behind this diary, which is then published in 1971 as this anonymous book, Go Ask Alice, a real diary by Anonymous. And then 7 years later, Jay's Journal came out and did kind of the same thing. Jay's Journal was sort of a sibling book. It was the story of this of a teenager, this time a young man who's pulled into witchcraft and black magic. He also dies, leaves behind a diary, and that diary then gets published anonymously as Jay's Journal. And they both, and Go Ask Alice especially, that book, when it came out, it really changed American culture in a huge way. Go Ask Alice kind of invented the modern young adult genre in some ways, sort of in lockstep with Judy Blume, and it sold 5 million copies. It really helped to cement a lot of ideas about the war on drugs, and it casts a massive shadow. I mean, even today, Go Ask Alice is still, it has left a huge footprint in American literature.
And still sells as nonfiction often, right? Depending on, like the imprint. But it seems like, like Go Ask Alice was originally kind of marketed to parents as opposed to teens. Like it was that sense of like, do you want to know what your kids are up to? Like, this is the thing that you need to read because
exactly.
Like this is very scary. Like this is a young woman who is very quickly hooked on drugs, who ends up on the streets, who ends up like in all kinds of dangerous situations, and then dies. It was only like once it like based on, and I really just learned this like reading your book, but just because of the energy it built in terms of like parents reading it, kids, teenagers were like, what, what's that? And then they started reading it. So even though it played this incredibly important like role in the young adult like segment, it really was meant to scare the shit out of parents at first.
Yeah, because as the 60s became the 70s, there was a couple of things sort of happening in tandem. I try never to use the phrase perfect storm, but it's just unavoidable sometimes. But there was all of these things that were shifting with American society. I mean, obviously we'd come off this very tumultuous decade, in the 60s, and there was JFK and MLK and RFK and Malcolm X and just all of these, all of these assassinations. And of course, there was, the war in Vietnam was heating up, and there was just social unrest everywhere. And to a lot of people who, resisted change or were unnerved by change, it just seemed like society was coming apart. And as is often the case, the alarm bell really started to get rung in earnest when that started reaching into the suburbs. And the suburbs is obviously code for a lot of different things. And one of the other things that happened throughout the 20th century and really became in many people's minds a full-fledged epidemic in the late 60s, early 70s was the Runaway Syndrome. And I think I don't have the book in front of me, but I forget exactly what it is, but it was the number of runaways was doubling every year until I think in 1966, it was something like 400,000 teenagers ran away from home long enough to be declared missing. And by 1970, the average runaway was a middle class white girl who was barely 15. And that is one of those things that then started to become its own sort of story in the media. And parents were thinking, we can't talk to these kids today because they're all on the goofballs or whatever. And so we need to figure out what's going on with them. And the communication seemed to have broken down between the generations. And so Go Ask Alice comes along to say, well, this is what your children are up to right now. And this is what they're up against. These are the dangers that are waiting for them. And so adults read Go Ask Alice as this sort of cautionary tale, or almost this, somebody called it a documentary novel. The idea that because it was marketed as this true story, as this diary. And so adults read it to trying to figure out what was going on with their kids behind closed doors. What's going on when we're not around. Teenagers, on the other hand, latched on to Go Ask Alice because there's this sort of dichotomy that when adults read Go Ask Alice, they fixated on the actual events. In other words, on, the drugs she's taking and the sex she's having, and the fact that she's running away from home and that she suddenly becomes belligerent and unmanageable. And so adults are fixating on what Alice is doing and all of the danger she's facing. Young people, as opposed to fixating on the event, young people identified with the girl herself. In other words, adults said, I can't believe these things she's doing. And young people said, this girl breaks my heart. Because one of the things that Go Ask Alice did and really still does is it captures the feeling, the tone of what it is like to be a teenager, which is a time in life that you could not pay me enough to return to. And there's just, when you are a teenager, you simultaneously feel like you're losing your mind and that you're the only sane person on the planet. And it's just this constant tug of war, this strange mix of emotions. And it's just this hyperkinetic, frazzled state where you feel like all the circuits in your head are overloading, and you feel like a child and an adult all at once, and you want freedom and you're afraid of freedom, and you're nostalgic for this childhood you haven't totally left, and you're excited for adulthood, and yet it's a little overwhelming. And Go Ask Alice channeled all of that into this really fast-paced, this really frazzled narrative that has no chapters, no real breaks. It's almost, this is another cliche, but it's almost like the internet before the internet, where it is just one short form entry after another. Some are a couple of pages, some are only a paragraph, some are only a few sentences, and it's just bam, bam, bam. And before you know it, you're done, and you're exhausted and thrilled and sad and frightened. And so it's this impossible jangle of emotions that resonates perfectly with a lot, with the adolescent mind in many ways.
And yet written by like a 52-year-old Mormon.
It is sort of amazing. It's and in a strange way, I just mentioned Judy Blume a second ago because I think the year before, I might have this wrong. I think the year before Go Ask Alice came out in September of 71. I think in 1970, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret came out. That might have also been 71, but I think that was 70. And, and when Judy Blume wrote Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, she was 40. And so there really is, and I think this is a thing you usually find with musicians, but it's also there obviously in writing, where there are people who remember, and there are people who are able to conjure up, again, some of the specifics, those change over time and with the era, but the emotional tenor of what it's like to go through certain things in your life and certain phases in your life, there are people who just intentionally or inadvertently know, they're able to capture that. And you get what I think Yeats called the shock of self-recognition. And Go Ask Alice really did that.
Judy Blume, she, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, is it feels like an experience she actually had, right?
Absolutely.
Unlike Go Ask Alice, which is, and I think that that's really interesting that it captures clearly like an emotional truth of loneliness and striving and isolation, right? Something that feels very universal and important to certain teenagers, who, written by somebody who certainly never did all those drugs or lived on the street, and even, for an audience who also haven't done that, but still really relate to the emotional core, which I think is very different than Judy Blume.
I think so. And I think one of the books that I sometimes compare Go Ask Alice to is Carrie by Stephen King. And, I, to the best of my knowledge, have no pyrotelekinetic abilities. I mean, it's.
Oh, you might try right now.
There's still time. I mean, it's, maybe I just haven't been in a long enough line at the supermarket. I mean, we'll see. But the reason, but Carrie did and still does resonate, I mean, obviously with big swaths of people, but I think a lot of people discover Carrie when they are teenagers, because, I think Stephen King was, I think he was like in his mid to late 20s, maybe, when he wrote that, and he was a school teacher, but that's still not quite the same thing as, as being a teenager. And obviously, the nuts and bolts of the novel Carrie are very, I mean, they're science fiction and or fantasy and or horror. I mean, they're not set in the real world, but people identify with Carrie White, not because she has these telekinetic abilities and not because she can throw knives with her mind. It's just, it's because of, it's because she has this fractured relationship with her mother, and because she feels picked on and isolated at school, and she feels like an ugly duckling. And it's, so all of these other things are just sort of the window dressing for what you said, the emotional tone and tenor. And, and that's a thing that sort of fades, I think, out of almost a sense of self-preservation as you get older. You just, your emotions, those that get attenuated a little bit, because I think it's just not, you just can't be at that frequency forever, because it gets overwhelming. And it's one of those things that does level out. I sometimes tell people that if you read, I've had people read this book and they say, oh, I've never read Go Ask Alice, I have to read that first. And I sometimes say that if you read Go Ask Alice for the first time as an adult, or if you haven't read it for a long time, if you haven't read it for decades, it's just going to seem melodramatic. I mean, it's like when you talk to a teenager and it's either, when you're a teenager, it's either the best day of your life or the end of the world. And as an adult, even your reflexive response is like, oh, don't be so dramatic. But of course, when you're in the middle of it, it's not melodrama. It is actually how it feels, and it's how it seems, and that is your reality. And it's a little bit like Saturday Night Fever also in that way, the movie, in that people who have never seen Saturday Night Fever or haven't seen it for a long time, they think it's campy or it's kitschy or it's corny or it's funny. And they're a little bit,
No, it's very serious.
You watch that movie, you're going to be depressed for several days. I mean, it's really bleak, but it's all about tone. And Alice, Alice absolutely really nails that.
So do you think, so like that, like one, I had no idea. Like I kind of heard that Go Ask Alice, wasn't true, that it was not actually written by a teenage girl, right? I had not read it. By the time I think I had the opportunity to read it, at that point I kind of grokked that it there was something kind of sus about it. But I had no idea that the actual like author had written so many, had found so many diaries.
Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah, like she was pretty lucky with all of those diaries that she came across. And yet, and clearly, it was all fiction. All of those diaries were fiction. Although some of them, as you say, like had a core, like maybe a core root in an actual voice. And yet Go Ask Alice was the best, right? Of those books. And so here's my question, like, is that Beatrice, the writer, or is that the editor that she actually gave the so-called diaries to, who put it together in a way that like made that book work?
It's probably a mix of the two. I mean, I think there is something to the lightning in a bottle theory. I mean, it's, and you sort of see this with bands sometimes, or, filmmakers, or anybody who makes any kind of art, where they come out of the gate, it's often the first thing they've done, or the first thing they've done that, has a large audience, or that, and it's just sort of magical, and it's great in a way that is real, but almost intangible, or can't be easily defined or explicated. And then they try to recreate it. And even if especially if they try to recreate it by doing the same thing, sometimes that succeeds, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you just get a pale version, and sometimes then it becomes a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. And I think it's the case with so much in the way of commercial art, in that you sometimes have a sense of why one thing works and another doesn't, when on the surface they seem very similar. But to a large degree, you just don't know. And if you did know, then every book would be a bestseller and every song would be a #1. I think that it's a book that works. It's a book that almost works in spite of itself. And I don't want to mention, it would be sort of tactless to mention other books that fall into this category. But
do it.
I will say that, for example, I love the book The Martian by Andy Weir. And And The Martian almost, I mean, it shouldn't work on some level, in the sense that, as my brother, I was like, you should read this book, The Martian. And he got, I don't know, he got like 4 chapters, and he's like, this is just a book of instructions. He's like, I can't do this. It's like, it's just a list of things this guy's got to do. All right, I gotta like electrolyze hydrazine. Okay, great. And I have to turn on the oxygenator. And he's just like, this is just a list of things to do. No. And now, but obviously a lot of people read that book and it was way more than the sum of its parts. I mean, another book, and again, I say this with love because I love this book and I love this author, World War Z by Max Brooks. On some level, there's a sort of sometimes a sameness to the voices of the characters. And again, it's not like I'm Faulkner. Like, I don't know, I'm just saying that it's,
Faulkner, who also has some sameness to his voices.
Well, it's as a friend of mine once said, he said this in the mid-90s, but he was talking about whatever the new Kevin Smith film was at that point. He was like, I get it. He's like, all these characters are just Kevin Smith with a thesaurus. No, thank you. And so there are occasions where you can see on the page, you can see the creative or the structural limitations, or you can see how the writing is in some objective way limited, or meets certain goals but doesn't meet others, and yet the whole thing works as a piece. It all works and exceeds any sort of reasonable expectations. And Go Ask Alice is like that. At the same time, and you alluded to this, a woman named Catherine Fitzgerald was the actual in-house editor for Go Ask Alice, and she'd been doing that for a long time, and she'd been working in children's books, for quite a while. She actually won, and she ended up winning a thing called the Christopher Award for Excellence in Editorial Achievement, specifically for her work on Go Ask Alice. And so she did quite a lot to help shape that book into its final form.
Yeah, it seems like it. So I want to ask this because I see it in the chat, and I also have it in my own head. If you can talk a little bit about just your research and reporting process, because you clearly, like, you traveled, Rick, for this book, which is like something a reporter does. So tell us about that.
That's yes. Well, first of all, I should say that well, never mind. I was just about to, as I approach my dotage, I'm trying to get better about interrupting my own tangents. Yeah. So I mean, I started this book, the research for this, I think the same way that everybody starts everything now, which is I just went to Google and I was just like started looking around the internet. And at first, because I mean, my first thought was that somebody had to have written this book already. I just thought this has to exist because I can't be, I mean, as you said, this book continues to sell. Even people who have not read Go Ask Alice know about it. I sometimes say, if you've read it, it's affected your life. If you haven't read it, and in fact, if you haven't heard of it ever, it's still affected your life. It's such a part of the culture. And I discovered that nobody had written it. And so then I started just researching everything I could find online, which was not a lot. When I started this book in 2015, a 4-page article from 1979 was still the most in-depth thing written about Beatrice Sparks and Go Ask Alice. And there'd been some other supplemental reporting sort of in the mid 2000s, but and everything else just seemed to be regurgitated bits of those 2 articles. There just had not been a lot done. And that was strange, but it was surprising, and it was also kind of encouraging. And I thought, well, okay, well, let me see what's out there that nobody has found. And I just had to go sort of analog. So then it became calling phone numbers, like landlines that were usually disconnected, and sending letters that came back undeliverable or unopened. And then it was like literally being not just a poor man's Carl Bernstein, like a destitute man's Carl Bernstein, like knocking on doors and just feeling all kinds of awkward as I stood there with, I just standing there with a pen and a notebook, like, just sort of impersonating Columbo, going like, I need to ask you about this house you live in. And just talking to people who, I thought might know something about the real story. And, it's the sort of thing where you build from the outside in. And I say as though I'm an expert on this, but the way I did it anyway. But once you can find one, at least for me, once you can find one person or one fact or one provable event or incident, then you can kind of, you can sort of daisy chain those things together. And then eventually, you just end up in, a basement at some library or at some, county assessor's office, just getting paper cuts and sneezing a lot as you go through boxes and boxes of stuff that nobody's looked at since the Carter administration. So
was there anybody you talked to that you wished you could have included in the book but ended up not?
That is a good question. There's somebody that I talked to, but I wasn't able to put in the book. Actually,
Yeah, for whatever reason.
yeah. I mean, there's a few sort of, you know this like far better than I do, that one of the hardest things is just cutting stuff out, even though it's good and entertaining and funny and smart and whatever, just because it gets in the way of the narrative. You're like, I love this, but it's the killing your darlings thing. I talked to, at one point, I talked to a lawyer who had defended the person who was accused of. So back in 1970, there was what I think the news media at the time called the nation's first mass hallucinogenic spiking. And it was this story that dominated the news. This is back when a single story, the news cycle just went on for like 9 months sometimes. So there was this thing that was called a swinging singles party in Marina Del Rey. And it was, the whole story is just bonkers, but it was, anyway, this guy got busted for allegedly spiking this entire party, like spiking all the food and beverages with with LSD. And I interviewed his lawyer, and his lawyer was just fantastic, because he was just one of those like 70s guys that just still has kind of the 70s vibe to him. And he was, and he just had all of these like strange, like he'd represented this guy, but he'd also represented the Hells Angels, and he'd also represented like Sirhan, and then he also represented, I think, somebody from the Black Panthers at one point. And he just had, just these fascinating stories. And and I just wasn't able to include it because that, anyway, just because I wasn't. So
No, it sounds like its own book.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah, it's yeah.
Huh. Tell us a little bit about Jay's journal, and like, to me, that like as a reader of your book, moving through Go Ask Alice and how that kind of went, it seemed like Jay's journal like just escalated in a way that like was kind of very heartbreaking.
Yeah, so Go Ask Alice is much better known, has sold more, and is, and still has a lot of cultural currency. Jay's journal, which came out in December 78, January 79, is, as I said earlier, it's sort of a sibling book in the sense that it's another posthumous teenage diary, this time of a young man who's pulled into Satanism and witchcraft and dies.
But based on an actual diary that was like actually.
And that's the thing about Jay's journal, is that, there is a real life person at the core of Jay's journal. There's a real life person and a real life diary at the center of that book. There are sections in Jay's journal that are taken, sometimes big sections of them word for word, out of an actual teenage diary. And Jay's journal had, it really infected America in a lot of strange ways. So, for example, the thing that we've heard about a lot, and in fact, the new season of Stranger Things is talking a lot about the Satanic Panic, specifically the way it intersected with the Dungeons and Dragons, sort of scandal and controversy in the 1980s. The idea that D&D was luring your kids to the dark side, and et cetera. And that, for example, the Dungeons and Dragons and Satanism, those two things going together, that the flashpoint for that really was this town called Heber City, Utah. And that is a direct result of Jay's journal, because Jay's journal and the young man that book is ostensibly based on, that was just 25 minutes away from where that Dungeons and Dragons conflagration first happened. And the real insidious thing that Jay's journal gave us is the notion of occult related teenage suicide, because by the time Jay's journal, because the teenage, just as the teenage runaway crisis and drug use, that's the other thing about Go Ask Alice, is that the year Go Ask Alice came out, and drug puns are unavoidable in conversations like this, but the year that Go Ask Alice came out, it was sort of this all-time peak for people taking LSD. That year, I think in 71, 800,000 Americans tried LSD for the first time, which was the most ever. And so you had the increasing number of runaways, increasing number of people taking LSD. By the time Jay's journal came out, the teenage suicide rate had been rising steadily, and it had been going up and up and up and up. And between 1970 and 1980, I think the teenage suicide rate, it went up. It was something insane. It was something like 75 or 85%. And and the thing that really was disconcerting to people was that most of those teenage suicides were young white men, and it was not even close. It was 5-to-1 was the ratio. And so there was this like, well, what do young white men have to be depressed about? What's going on? But nobody knew, because of course the person who kills themselves isn't around to tell you anymore, and families sometimes don't know or don't want to talk about it. And plus it involves a whole lot of social problems and mental health issues that America was and is very uncomfortable talking about, and a lot of uncomfortable conversations and complex discussions that we're unable or not willing to have. And Jay's journal kind of cut through that Gordian knot and just presented this ready-made, this ready-made, very simple solution, all packaged up with a crimson bow. And it just said, well, it was the devil. And that's the sort of thing that, from any kind of remove, sounds ludicrous. And I'm sure it sounded ludicrous to a lot of people then, but it was readily embraced. And the idea of a cult-related teenage suicide, and anybody who lived through the 1980s or 1990s will remember this absolutely being a talking point in, and not just in churches, but in schools, on the news, in psychiatrists' offices, in reputable professional magazines of the mental health industry, the idea of teenage occult suicide. And that springs almost entirely from Jay's journal.
Yeah, and I want to make it really clear that actually the kid that Jay's journal is based on had mental health issues and committed suicide. He was not involved in any kind of satanic cult, but the writer took this journal because the mother had given it to her because she wanted her kid's death to mean something. And the writer took a few entries. I think you say 20 or 12.
There's about 24 genuine entries.
Right. And then created this whole narrative about this satanic cult that really is just completely made up. Yeah. And I just think that's important to reinforce.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you pointed that out. It's that it is, and it was just a wild and unconscionable distortion of reality. And so much of this comes from, one of the things about this story is you see this, as I think Mick Jagger said, there's no present, there's only recycled past. And humans are great at not learning lessons. And one of the things that we do again and again is when we are faced with the idea, and I'm including myself in this, but when we're faced with the choice between tackling, or grappling with some really complex issue that requires having a lot of maybe difficult conversations, or requires, things like subtlety and nuance, or reasoned assessments, or, God forbid, patience and investigation into things. If we're given that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're offered this very simple solution and this very simple one sentence answer to this incredibly complex problem. And especially if we're given a scapegoat, if we're given someone or something to blame, that is the thing that humans will go, that is the thing we are always inclined to go for. And so there's, so if you are, so when Alden Barrett, who is the young man who was, the sort of real life person behind Jay's journal, when he died, and he was almost certainly clinically depressed. He'd struggled with, substance abuse. It turned his life around, but obviously still had, had a lot of, mental upset he was dealing with. When he died, the very first real study of adolescent psychology and adolescent mental health had only just finished. The very first study of adolescent mental health had just been done when he died. It was, that field was still on training wheels. And, that's a thing that has, that's improved to some degree, but, but especially if you are, as you said, if you're sort of grappling with a lot of troublesome issues, but somebody comes along and just says, that here's the answer. Here's why it happened. Because if you're a parent who's trying to understand, how did this horrible thing happen to my son and to me and to my family? And that not knowing can just eat you alive. And so it becomes very, very tempting for parents to just reach for the first solution that someone, good intentioned or not, offers them. And I feel like I've totally gotten far afield from the point here.
No, this is great. I will say, full disclosure, my father-in-law was like one of the early D&D guys. So in the 70s,
Mhm.
you know, so like very much, um, uh, yeah, like affected by the Satanic Panic
Oh
thing.
yeah.
Like it, you know,
Oh, it was
he spent his career making D&D stories.
the Satanic Panic is one of those things that, yeah, again, now, although, as we've seen, I mean, there was a study. So there's a study that came out last year from the Public Religious Research Institute. This came out in March of 2021. And it said something like 28% of Republicans, and this is a reputable survey from a reputable source, said 28% of Republicans, I think, believe that the United States government, financial systems, and media are controlled by cabals of Satan-worshiping pedophiles.
Right.
And 15% of all Americans believe that. So it's clearly a thing that doesn't go away, but it is one of those things that is far less amusing in the moment. I mean, especially when people started going to jail for it. I mean, there are people who went to prison for years and even decades sometimes because they were convicted of these satanic crimes that not only they hadn't committed, but they could not have committed. No one could have, because they were impossible.
Mhm.
And yet, and yet in open court, they were convicted of these sort of insane satanic ritual abuse crimes, and went to prison for a long time.
Yeah,
And
like literally like eating babies.
absolutely, yeah. Or it's like they took me into a hot air balloon with flying robot wizards, and it's like the judge is like, sounds good, guilty, boom.
Yep.
It's and there's obviously more than one source for a lot of those things. It's a confluence of events, but Jay's journal absolutely fed into that and really struck a match to something that that had been that was already had sort of been smoldering for a while.
So speaking of sources, in terms of just constructing this book, like, can you like unpack a little bit your approach to like you don't have footnotes, right?
I'm sorry?
And you don't have footnotes, and you don't have you don't source a lot.
Mhm.
You source some stuff. And can you talk a little bit about like your process in terms of making those choices?
So the citations were one of the, so part of that, there's two reasons that the citations are not in the book. One is just because of length. So this book, supply chain issues pushed it back by a month. It was supposed to come out in June. And I think we were actually still editing and trying to cut it down. I mean, in April, I think. I mean, it was like up until the last, trying to like shave as many words and sentences as we possibly could. So part of it was just length. One of the other reasons why I omitted the citations is that most of the factual statements, or the the declarative statements in this book, they fall into basically three categories. And the first is stuff that's checkable and public. So, for example, the weather on a given day, or the what a headline was on a particular August day in 1985. The second category is things that aren't public as such, but are still fairly checkable. For example, the layout of the behavioral science unit at Quantico, or the format of one of the worthiness interviews that a Latter-day Saint goes through, after when they turn 12. And then the last category is the smallest, and that's things that aren't public and also, for reasons of privacy, aren't currently checkable. And fortunately, that only affects about 50 pages of the book toward the end. And by that point, and I say something in the book about this, that by that point I think I've done my best to accrue a little trust, and then it's up to the reader to believe me or not. It's up to them. I would never expect anybody. One of the things this book does demonstrate is that blind faith in anything is not always a great idea. If I'd faced that choice with the rest of the book, the book would not exist in its current form. But I tried to stick when possible to things that that could be confirmed with just a simple internet search for the most part. So I tried to underscore most of those choices like that.
All right, so I have a question from a viewer, which is, did the author ever acknowledge that she had altered Jay's journal?
Well, as with many, so here's the thing about Beatrice Sparks, is that she was not just the unreliable narrator of other people's lives. She was sort of the unreliable narrator of her own life. And the backstory for Go Ask Alice or Jay's Journal or any of her other books, sort of rotated. It was like a magic 8 ball, kind of, depending on when you asked her or what day, the backstory changed. At one point, she gave an interview to, I believe, the Minneapolis Star. It was the newspaper. And she said, I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly because I don't have it in front of me. But she said something about, I only changed the grammar, the punctuation, and I omitted a few things like household tasks. So that, in her telling, all she really did was to kind of clean up, the syntax and the grammar, and then to like remove it when he's bitching about taking out the trash or something. At one point she said that it was from a single diary. At one point she said that it was from 3 different diaries. At one point she said it was from a diary and interviews with 2 of his friends. And that is sort of the same litany of rotating backstories that she gave for Go Ask Alice. And
she never told the truth, basically. She never copped to it.
Yeah, there was never a moment where there was full disclosure. And even if there had been, it would have been difficult to tell, because again, she excelled at forgetting her own backstories for these teenage diaries.
Yeah, if anybody else has questions, you can post them in the Q&A. I'm going to move you over so I can pull up some more of my questions, which I haven't even looked at because this has been such an interesting conversation. Like I will say, and this is really embarrassing, but it's just you and me, right? So I feel like we can talk directly, and you're not going to tell anybody about this because I'm about to confess something that is embarrassing. Go Ask Alice, super famous book, which I certainly have, as I said, heard of, spoken hushed whispers in the playground about. I did not know the origin of the title until I read your book.
Oh, that it was from White Rabbit?
I really didn't, and I know the song.
Well,
but
because
it just never occurred to me. And that was I was like, oh my God, yes.
Well, and that's actually a testament to how deeply embedded in culture Go Ask Alice is, that even though the song, it's not like the song White Rabbit is some obscure underground hit. I mean, it was like a massive hit in 1967, but the 3-letter phrase Go Ask Alice now stands alone as its own separate, discrete, part entry in the great American cultural encyclopedia. And so much, here is how much the phrase Go Ask Alice has transcended its origins in the Jefferson Airplane song White Rabbit. In 1998, I believe, Grace Slick, who wrote and performed the song White Rabbit for Jefferson Airplane, she was getting ready to put out her memoir, and she was going to title her memoir Go Ask Alice. And at some point, somebody pulled her aside. They're like, ixnay on the Alice A. It's like somebody must have just told her, like, you can't. Sorry, you've lost that. It's like that phrase no longer belongs to her because it just is, it's just because it just becomes such a pillar of American, of American culture in some ways.
I think it's really interesting how it seems like that book in particular is so much a product of a pre-internet era, right? Like, so there were all of these reviews, and anybody who and there were a couple of reviews that you talk about in your book that were like a little cagey, where it was like they put diary in quotation marks or whatever, but they were really cagey about it because nobody wants to be the asshole who's like, this dead girl's diary isn't real, right? Nobody wants to be that guy. And because of that, and because it was not easily fact checkable at all, it created this inertia. And yet now with the internet, I think so many people think it's real because there's so many places on the internet that say it's real, right? So it's a really interesting dichotomy, I think, in terms of
what's interesting, and you really hit this on the head when you talked. This ties into your earlier point about when you asked me, you said, like, is it good? Is the writing actually good in and of itself? And in a weird way, the how do I put it? The somewhat unpolished nature of the writing in Go Ask Alice sort of lent credence to this idea that it was this unfiltered, unvarnished, teenage diary that had been lightly edited but was otherwise unchanged, because it is very ragged in places, and it's sort of the prose is very purple at times, and not like that's only a thing that happens in adolescence, but obviously the things can be a little bit overwrought when you're experiencing certain that flood of emotions sometimes for the first time when you're 15 or 16 or 17. And as you said, no one wanted to stomp on this dead girl by hinting that maybe she didn't really exist. And so in the first, I don't know, decade of Go Ask Alice's existence, I mean 90%, certainly 90% of the media, they treated that book as absolutely genuine. By the time the 2000s rolled around, it was maybe closer to 50-50 or 60-40, but it's still, even now, there's no unanimity of opinion there. If you go on the internet, go on Amazon, go anywhere of your choice, and you read the reviews, and you'll see that there is still this very stark divide of people saying, well, this is absolute, this is poppycock or whatever. Probably not poppycock, but
but I think they do. They say poppycock.
This is folderol. And balderdash and other
Holy
things.
mackerel.
Exactly. But there are other people who are clearly being, you can feel the sincerity when they say, like, this is a real story, and and the parents of this girl obviously were heartbroken, and they wanted to stop other teenagers or other families from suffering these same problems, and so they were kind enough to share her writing with the world, that I'm going to buy this for my kids, and I'm going to or this book helped. That's one of the weird things about Go Ask Alice especially, is it's undeniable that book has saved lives. I mean, there's just no way around that. I mean, there are, without a doubt, people who have either gotten clean and sober or have avoided drugs and alcohol altogether because of Go Ask Alice. I mean, that is a fact. And yet, at the same time, if you're reading Go Ask Alice and it lumps all of these drugs, LSD and heroin and marijuana, all into the same lethal basket, and then you get a little older and you find out that's not necessarily true, then maybe you start thinking, well, maybe adults are lying about a lot of other things to do with drugs. Mm-hmm. And Go Ask Alice also paved the way for Jay's journal, and Jay's journal indisputably undermined the cause of teenage mental health in this country. Mm-hmm. It absolutely undermined efforts to mitigate and prevent teenage suicide. And so, to say that those two books together have a tangled legacy is to really undersell it. I mean, it's a very, very difficult knot to untangle in terms of their ultimate impact. But going into this project, I had sort of come to the conclusion of my 30s. I don't know where I got this idea. I somehow decided that Go Ask Alice was a co-production of the Nixon administration and like a Madison Avenue advertising firm. I don't know where I got that from, but I thought that like Nixon had recruited BBD&O or some Don Draper type, and to create this diary and then peddle it sort of off the radar, as this book, as a way to as anti-drug propaganda, which, as it turns out, was about 20% true, but only 20%.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have lots of questions, but I do want to give you an opportunity to read a little chunk, just because we've talked a lot about this book. So if you can read a page or two, and then we'll get to a couple of questions.
All right. So this is from near the beginning of the book, and I've condensed it a little bit, but just a bit. All right. She's leaving home, June 1971. In the 6th floor city room of the Miami News, Nicolette Hondros stared at the little yellow paperback. It was an ARC, or Advance Review copy, which meant it was bare bones. No artwork, no dust jacket, no price tag. Just a bright yellow cover with 5 red words. Go Ask Alice. Author anonymous. Hondros flipped through the paperback, checking the length. It was brief, with spacious text, a book you could read in one evening. It began with an editor's note. Go Ask Alice is based on the actual diary of a 15-year-old drug user. Names, dates, places, and certain events have been changed in accordance with the wishes of those concerned. The next 159 pages were a slideshow of personal destruction. Lured into drug use by unsavory friends, a bright middle-class teenager succumbs to addiction and impulse. She runs away from home, but finds only heartache, a wasteland of pushers and prey. As things unravel, the diarist suffers a horrifying breakdown and lands in a psychiatric ward. She vows to start over, but the darkness soon returns, and she dies at 17, leaving only the diary behind. If you paid close attention, there were things that didn't make sense, like the timeline. After her first LSD trip, Alice takes amphetamines and tranquilizers and pain pills and even shoots up, and only then tries marijuana. And do mental wards really allow injured, delusional patients to keep a diary, much less a pen, within reach? There were inconsistencies. If the book used pseudonyms, then why were some names blanked out, as in, I met Fawn blank at the store today? There was also pure nonsense. Go Ask Alice put every drug, LSD, marijuana, heroin, speed, into one lethal basket with no attempt at nuance. But few people noticed these hangnails. Go Ask Alice jerked and skipped like a rickety thrill ride, veering from one crisis to the next. There were no chapters, no real breaks, just a chain of frazzled entries, often undated and barely coherent. The result was a kind of dazed momentum. Readers plunged forward, unable to stop or get their bearings. Before they knew it, Alice was dead, and they were staring at a blank page, wondering how it all went wrong. Early readers checked the inside flap, scanning or hoping for the words fiction or novel, but there was only that note from the editors saying Alice was based on a real-life diary, the desperate cry of a burning angel. The mystique got people talking, the talk got people buying, and the buzz began to feed on itself. Before long, demand was outstripping supply, and Alice was frequently sold out. Library wait lists stretched for weeks or months, and all of it generated more press. There were skeptics. A few papers listed Alice as fiction or with no description at all, just the title and publisher, but those were exceptions. And when the paperback arrived, it had a new definitive subtitle, Go Ask Alice, A Real Diary by Anonymous. And there was something else, something the book didn't say, not on the front cover or on the back or anywhere in the fine print. It was buried in the government's massive catalog of copyright entries, third series, 1971, January to June, page 1308. Sparks, comma, Beatrice M. C. Go Ask Alice. Scene.
I know, that gives me goosebumps. All right, so I want to get to a couple of these questions before we finish this thing. Was there anything during your research that surprised you or challenged your own preconceived notions about the story, Rick?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, unknown person.
Literally anonymous attendee.
I'll take meta for 1,000. A couple of things. I mean, one, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, that, going into this, I mean, there were these two sort of competing ideas have emerged about Go Ask Alice. One is that it's whole cloth propaganda, just created absolutely, just pure nonsense, just pure fiction. And the other is that no, it might be edited or it might be polished, but it was a real diary and there was a real Alice. So those are the two sort of poles. And what I eventually learned is that neither of those takes is really correct. Neither of those things is really true. The actual truth is somewhere between. And without giving too much away, I will say that, I'm not trying to be coy. There is an answer to that. The idea of, is it real? Was she real? There is an answer. And by the end of the book, I lay out, the broad strokes of what really happened. And it was not what I expected, but it did make a lot of sense. In terms of something else being surprising, I think just how big the story was. I mean, if you told me at the outset that this, because I had no idea going into this, like what to expect. But if you told me that the story literally went from, the highest, sort of tiers of Hollywood to the behavioral science unit, the profiling unit at Quantico, literally into the Oval Office, and then all across the country, and then all of those threads coalesce. They all meet in this little patch of Utah desert that is also called the fraud capital of America. I mean, there's just no way. I mean, every time I thought, well, this story can't possibly get any more bonkers, it just did. I mean, I just, even now, having spent far longer on this project than I ever anticipated, I just cannot, I just still can't get over just how big and strange and weird and, fascinating and angering and insane the story is.
All right, another question. Rick, did you ever interview anybody from the Red House in Provo, Utah?
I did actually, and that shows up toward the end of the book. And that house is its own kind of story. When I mentioned it having blood red walls. the inside of that house was just the palette of a stop sign. It was all just red and white and white and red. It was like some strange Lewis Carroll meets Game of Thrones, like in the lair of the Crimson Queen kind of a thing. But yeah, and toward the end of the book and in the author's note, you will you'll read a little bit of my interaction, with the occupants of that house.
One of the things that I really loved, like a turn that the book takes that I thought was like really artful, is and I think like you, right, like in this conversation, I think are being much more generous than in the book, which is a real kind of like it's a kind of like very, very smart step-by-step kind of takedown, right, of this woman, and of her work, and like in the kind of ripples, right, that are created from it. And then you do this wonderful, like, you take this wonderful turn toward the end where you then quote all of these people whose lives have been made better by this book, like just quotes, just people who were like, yeah, no, I read Go Ask Alice when I was 17, and like it was exactly what I needed, and it changed my life, and it saved my life. And like I just thought that was just, it was really masterful from a storytelling point of view, from a narrative point of view, to remind us of that. And then, like just by reminding us of that, it kind of creates this kind of larger question about like, what is truth? And and how does it matter? Like this is a book that, clearly had this huge cultural impact. And was, mostly bullshit. And yet maybe captured like a core truth about Beatrice and about maybe somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And certainly resonated,
and
right, with some kids. Like I just think that like you raise such an interesting existential kind of question in this book, and I really applaud you for that.
Thank you. You were saying that the book is very much sort of a step-by-step deconstruction, and and that's one of the reasons why I do include some footnotes that are a little more snarky, I guess is probably the right word. And so there's a little bit of snarkiness, or sort of maybe gallows humor or whatever in the book, and part of that is just to mitigate what is otherwise. I mean, the story otherwise threatens to become really, it's a bleak story in a lot of ways. It is, as somebody once said, kind of a series of down endings. And so I do try to leaven that a little bit, but at the same time, the story is what it is, and there's no getting around a lot of that. But as you also said, it's, there's a lot of conversations happening. These I'm sure have always happened, but I feel like especially now, there's sort of a superheated element to these discussions. The idea of, do we separate the artist from the art, or don't we? Or, and do we separate, the art from the motivation for the art? And if the art is created for cynical reasons, does that mean it has no value? And if you find value in art, how does that affect how you have to see, the person behind it, or where it came from, or this other like unintentional, this other externality, this other fallout that it might have had. And those are all really fascinating conversations. And, the other thing is that, this book has, there are, bad people doing good things sometimes, and good people doing bad things. And because nobody is just one thing, I think it's kind of comforting sometimes to believe that, that there's the black hat and the white hat. And and I'm not saying that's never the case, but things are rarely as cut and dried as, as we like to think. And as I said, it's, Go Ask Alice. It really is a fascinating thing to look at the trajectory that book has taken, and the the impact it's had, because undoubtedly there are people who read that book and they thought adults are just full of it when it comes to drugs. I'm not going to believe anything they tell me from now on, and who then, and that can lead to some poor choices. At the same time, as you said, at the end, there's a young woman named Morgan I talked to, who she discovered Go Ask Alice in 2010 when she was 12. And so long after, it was like 40 years after that book had come out. And she credits Go Ask Alice with keeping her clean and sober. And for reasons I lay out in the book, it almost certainly saved her life. There was the novelist Laurie Halse Anderson, who wrote a fantastic novel called, she's written a lot of great books, but she broke through with a book called Speak. I talk about her in this book. She had gone through a lot of real terrible personal events and a lot of trauma in her life. And she discovered Go Ask Alice, and it was sort of a lifeline for her, this thing she grabbed onto. And so it's, art is this constant, weird, shifting, morphing thing. And it sometimes intersects with and has to be taken in the context of the person who created it. And sometimes it's its own thing. And that can fluctuate from person to person and moment to moment. And I'm getting way too existential and serious.
I love it. I love it. And I will say too, Rick, congratulations on the reviews you've gotten for this book. There have been so many great kind of, and I would say what I find interesting is that it feels like the reviews are these stepping off points as think pieces, right? Where big mainstream publications are revisiting this story based on your book, as if it's a big reveal. Right?
Yes.
As if it's a reveal that, this is not actually a diary.
All may not be as it seems.
Yeah, which I is fascinating, right? But it creates an opportunity to have these discussions in a way that I think is really important.
Well, and another reason I think that Go Ask Alice especially, perseveres is that it is such, I think I call it a social Rorschach at one point, in that, if you are a teenager looking for someone whose life seems as fractured and frazzled and tumultuous as your own, you'll find it. If you're an adult looking for proof that the kids today are, out of control and they're in need of some restraint, that Go Ask Alice will give you the evidence for that too. If you're a cynic, you'll see, a callow attempt at manipulative marketing. If you are idealistic, you look at that and you'll think, here are some people who tried to turn a tragedy into something that helped people. One of the things
it's a book for everybody, is what you're saying.
Yeah, not unlike my own. Somebody
That's
actually.
what I mean. It's for everybody. Order it now.
The strange thing is, if you go on TikTok, which I don't because I'm ancient, but if you go on TikTok, there are teenagers, there are people 13, 14, 15, 16 reading Go Ask Alice. And it's not like they were told to do it or by their parents or assigned it in class, although that does still happen sometimes. That book resonated with people who were 15 years old in 1971, and it resonates with 15-year-olds now. And that's, so again, that gets back to the point of, at some point a thing does, at some point it does become, I've already said more than some of its parts, but it does transcend itself and transcends its motives, and it becomes, we as readers over 50 years have imbued Go Ask Alice, whatever the reality of it at the beginning, it's like we have injected ourselves and our belief and our thoughts and all of our various neuroses and hopes and fears into that book, and we have animated what may have once been an inanimate construct. And that book will outlive us all. There's just no getting around it.
What do you call it? A perfect storm?
If absolutely required to.
All right, so I have a couple more questions I want to get through, just because people are asking them here in the various, oh my goodness, in fact, there's a lot of them. Somebody says, I have lately a new appreciation for the 70s. What is your opinion of the 70s? Keep that to a minute.
what is my opinion of the
What
70s?
is your opinion of the 1970s? Yes.
Well, it's funny actually. So I actually wrote this for something. I ended up not using it, but this is real quick. This is just 2 quick paragraphs. I wrote this for an intro to a thing, and I ended up not
Like, did you ask yourself that question?
what do I think of the 70s?
Uh-huh.
I
happen to have this chapbook.
I wrote this and then never got a chance to use it. And so, as a writer, it's like you try not to throw anything out because I can use this later for something else. I wrote this. I said, imagine an America riven by social conflict. A divisive president is driven from office and seemingly escapes prosecution while his underlings take the fall. And citizens realize that their leaders aren't just more corrupt than anyone realized, but possibly more corrupt than anyone imagined. Overseas, the nation is dragged into proxy wars with a newly emboldened Russia, while at home, inflation and spiraling gas prices threaten to crack the economy. The country splits down the middle over school prayer, abortion, and LGBT issues, and a huge chunk of the voting public believes that Satan-worshipping pedophiles are secretly controlling the government. That's the America that produced and embraced 2 separate books, a pair of teenage diaries that bracketed the 1970s. So I don't know if any of that sounds vaguely familiar to anybody who's watching right now, but I mean, the 70s, the 70s were, in the early 1970s, there were bombings, like homegrown terror, like domestic terrorist bombings happening at the rate of 5 per day, 5 a day, which is just unbelievable and impossible to imagine.
In the United States.
Was true.
Yep.
In the United States.
Yep.
Yeah. So the 70s were, they were.
I try to remind myself of that when I get super worried. It's like, at least there aren't bombings happening every day.
Say that a little louder. Let the universe hear you say that.
Yeah. I don't know.
At least that won't happen, right?
Totally. Just the shootings. So the several questions about audiobook stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, is this available in audiobook? In which case, are you going to be the voice of the book? And how can people get it?
I am glad you asked that. So there is an audiobook. So the audiobook is currently available at a lot of retailers right now, online, like, at wherever you buy audiobooks, unless that place is Audible, in which case it will be available later this week. So there's been a delay of a few days with Audible, but it's coming to Audible. It's already kind of everywhere else. So,
but especially if you can buy it through Powell's.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. I'm just picking my way through this, trying to navigate. So there is an audiobook. It's going to be available everywhere within a few days. So the audiobook is narrated by a very talented voice actor, a woman named Gabra Zachman. And so for anybody who is now going, but why didn't Rick read this? Why didn't Rick read this? Well, 2 reasons. One is that, this is, there's a, sort of, as is sort of a big story with a lot of characters, but it is, it's a very strongly female story, and there's a lot of strong female characters. And honestly, the connective thread, the through line through the story is a woman, and it's got a very strong female component to it. And so it seemed right, to have a female narrator in that sense. Also, if I'm really being totally honest here, another reason for that is that I felt like I could kind of do no better than expected. And so here's what I mean by that. Like, if I'd done like the world's best reading, if I'd done a flawless, like the best reading of an audiobook that anybody ever heard, I feel like that still would have been like, well, yeah, you worked in radio for 30 years and you wrote it. So yeah. So whatever. Like, it's just like, if it had actually cured gout or something, people would have been like, well, of course it was good. That's what I thought. Whereas if I had read it and screwed it up in any way, like for those same reasons, because I wrote it and because I spent like decades working in radio and doing narration and voiceover, if I'd somehow made a mistake, it's like, then I have to pack up the dogs and move to Myanmar. Then I can never show my face in public again. So also Gabra Zachman did a great job.
I'm still kind of stuck on the audiobook that cures gout. I think that is a great pitch.
Well, I haven't pitched it yet. So feel free to beat me to it. I'm not really sure what gout is. It's just a thing I like to mention because Nixon had it.
I can tell you, it's the king's disease, right? Has to do with uric acid in your blood. causes inflammation, usually in the big toe, but can be also in other joints. Very painful, exquisitely painful, they call it.
Is it like phlebitis? I don't know what phlebitis is either.
I don't know what phlebitis is, but that sounds terrible.
I just find it a pleasing word to say.
It is. Is that with a PH or an F?
Yes, PHLEB, phlebitis.
Like a phlebotomist, so like probably blood related then.
Yes.
Can I also give you a compliment?
We're both just feeling our way through this. I have no idea. It's like yeah.
Sorry, so like, no, wait, seriously, Rick, I really want to compliment you on using the word myriad correctly in your book. It's not so much, but yet it means so much as a reader to see that word used correctly.
I aim to please.
Thank you for that.
It's what separates us from the savages.
Yeah, like I'm trying to cull some of these questions. So have you ever tried LSD? Oh, look, Pals is back. Weirdly, just as I can start to really get the interesting questions.
If you want to finish the last question.
Let's let Rick answer that, and then we can sign out.
Okay, sounds good.
They're talking about phlebitis. It's time to cut
Carlos in San Francisco. Have you ever tried LSD?
I don't know. Has he got something to share? What are we talking? Are we talking Orange Sunshine? What is the? No, my doors of perception have stayed resolutely closed and clouded thus far. But there's always the future.
You've never tried LSD?
Sorry, if I disappointed you, have I?
No. I'm just surprised.
I feel like I've failed you.
No, like not because I think like, oh, Rick has certainly done LSD. You went to college, right?
I mean, I feel like if I was like no, I'm not really, as David St. Hubbins would say, I'm not really university material. So no. But so maybe that's why. Maybe I missed out on LSD and Dave Matthews and whatever else one does in college. I think I've actually thought about this a lot, because if I was like a sort of, like George Plimpton, Oliver Sacks type, I think Oliver Sacks took LSD when he was like 82 for his last book for Hallucinations.
Yeah. And before that.
And I think, so if I were truly like a gay to lease, participatory journalist type, I would do that. But I think the answer is I'm just lame. I'm just. There's
no reason why you have to have taken it for this book. I'm just surprised because I rarely meet an adult who hasn't taken LSD.
Well,
but
especially
that's more about the people
honestly,
I hang out with.
In Portland, where it's like you go to get your morning coffee and they're like, here's your coffee. Would you like to microdose while you're here? It's just like a thing they just offer you now. And so I feel like it's inevitable. I don't know. Maybe I'll do it when we're done here. It's just, maybe the interview, think how colorful the interview would have been then.
This is going to be great. So like you go ahead and you just dial back into Zoom once you actually take the hit of LSD, and we'll be here. We'll all be here.
Rick Emerson is here to tell us that time has no meaning.
Yeah.
So I can only like feign LSD attempted humor even. So the 80s, the thing is that Nancy Reagan stuff has an effect, even if you know it's propaganda.
Yeah. Well, let's sign out with that.
Yes.
on that, I like
on that
excellent. Oh man. Well, just by the way, I thank you, Chelsea, so much for doing this, and Nick, thank you, and everybody at Powell's for being awesome, and for this has been great. I really appreciate it, and thank you. This is
you're so terrific, Rick, and this book is so terrific, and it's so incredibly interesting and so relevant. And I really recommend it. I can't recommend it enough. And I also recommend that if you're thinking about maybe I should buy this book, you should just do it right now. Through Pals, because why not? It's top of mind. Just buy it right now. Yeah, and apparently the audiobook as well. And if you need, Rick can also arrange a Zoom call where he just reads it to you out loud, chapter by chapter, over a series of nights. So just, let Pals know if you want to arrange that. It's expensive, but worth it.
Let me tell you about a thing called upselling, kid. Yes, it's it is. I will just close out just by saying that it is, I'm not trying to be humble bragging or fishing for compliments or whatever they say now, but it is, I mean, it is an amazing story. And I think I tell it well. And I think, but it's the story itself is just, you know, as I will wrap on this just to say that if you are, somebody asked me one, you know, it sounds like a joke to say like the audience for this book is everybody, but you know, if you are a child of the 70s or the 80s, or if you lived through the Satanic Panic, or if you always wonder how do these fictitious memoirs or nonfiction books make it into print, or if you wonder, if you're fascinated by the idea, the notion of a, you know, the moment when something real becomes myth, you know, this book is for you because it tells that story, and it's just every time you think it can't get weirder, it does. So anyway.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Rick and Chelsea, so much. And yeah, thanks. Definitely go check out Unmask Alice. And I put the link in there. And thank you for saying that, Chelsea. Yes. go get it. Go pick it up there. And while you're there, check out future events. We have a whole lineup of future events on pals.com. And we look forward to seeing you all at another one soon. But yeah, thank you both so much. Great conversation. It's great to listen to. And yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
All right.
Cool.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Bye.